Biased teacher harasses student in class, not realizing she's the principal's daughter. Welcome, everyone. Today, we invite you to join us on a journey of resilience, courage, and quiet strength. This is the story of a young girl named Leah, who faces unexpected challenges in the classroom, but through determination and support, she finds her voice. Let's begin. The morning sun filtered softly through the tall windows of Oakwood High School, casting a warm glow over the rows of polished desks. The bell had just rung, signaling the start of another school day, and students hurriedly made their way to their seats. Mrs. Thompson, the longtime English teacher, stood at the front of the class. Her demeanor was calm but strict, her reputation for maintaining order well known among students. Today, however, there was a faint shift in the atmosphere, a tension that some of the more perceptive students could sense, though they couldn't quite pinpoint the cause. As the last stragglers settled into their chairs, a new figure appeared at the door. Leah Johnson, a transfer student, hesitated slightly before stepping into the classroom. Her presence drew the curious gazes of her peers, some welcoming, others uncertain. Leah had moved to Oakwood with her father, Mr. Johnson, who had recently taken over as the new principal of the school. Though new to this environment, Leah was not new to the challenges of fitting into a new school. She carried herself with a quiet confidence, her backpack slung over one shoulder. As she made her way to an empty desk near the back of the room, Mrs. Thompson's eyes tracked Leah's movements, her lips curling into a brief, tight smile as Leah sat down. Well, it seems we have a new addition to our class today, she said, her voice polite but cool. I do hope you'll be able to keep up with the rigorous curriculum here. Miss Johnson. Leah nodded but said nothing. She was used to the scrutiny that came with being new. She'd learned over the years that it was best to observe before speaking, to understand the dynamics of her surroundings before making any bold moves. Mrs. Thompson, though polite on the surface, seemed to carry a certain reserve in her tone that Leah couldn't quite place. The day's lesson was about Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, a novel about justice, empathy, and moral courage. Mrs. Thompson began the discussion by asking the class about the central themes of the novel. As the conversation unfolded, Leah raised her hand, eager to contribute her thoughts. She had always been an avid reader and was particularly fond of books that explored human nature and ethics. Mrs. Thompson, however, glanced past Leah's raised hand and called on another student. Leah's hand slowly lowered, but her resolve remained. She listened carefully as other students shared their opinions, waiting for the right moment to try again. The teacher moved on, ignoring Leah's raised hand once more. But Leah didn't let it bother her. She was here to learn, and nothing would stop her from doing so. The tension in the room was subtle but undeniable. Some of the students noticed the slight dismissiveness in Mrs. Thompson's actions, but no one said a word. Leah, for her part, remained composed, her focus on the lesson at hand. She took detailed notes, her pen moving steadily across the pages of her notebook, even though Mrs. Thompson seemed to avoid acknowledging her. Leah's determination to succeed never wavered. As the class drew to a close, Mrs. Thompson announced that they would be working on a group project, pairing students together to analyze various themes of the novel. She smiled thinly as she glanced in Leah's direction. I'll be assigning the groups, she said. We wouldn't want anyone to feel out of place now, would we? Leah caught the subtle edge in the teacher's words, but said nothing. She knew that this was just another challenge, one that she would face with quiet strength and resilience. Her father had always taught her the importance of perseverance, of standing firm in her beliefs without being confrontational. As the bell rang and students began to gather their things, Leah took her time, her movements deliberate and unhurried. Mrs. Thompson's eyes followed her as she made her way toward the door. Miss Johnson, Mrs. Thompson called out. Leah turned, her expression neutral but alert. I hope you understand that in this class, we focus on facts and analysis, not personal opinions or agendas. I'd hate to see you struggle because of any confusion. Leah met the teacher's gaze, her voice calm but firm. I understand perfectly, Mrs. Thompson. I look forward to contributing in our next discussion." With that, Leah walked out of the room, leaving Mrs. Thompson to watch her go, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face for the briefest of moments. The week passed quietly, but under the surface, tensions were building. Leah continued to attend Mrs. Thompson's class with the same quiet determination she had shown on her first day. She sat near the back, attentively taking notes, her hand rising now and then when Mrs. Thompson posed a question to the class. But, just like before, the teacher's gaze slid past Leah each time, as though she didn't exist. The other students began to notice this odd dynamic, though no one spoke openly about it. Some shot Leah sympathetic glances when they saw her efforts to participate go unacknowledged. Others seemed to smirk in amusement, as if waiting for Leah to falter or for Mrs. Thompson to push her a little further. But Leah never wavered. She remained focused, maintaining a calm, collected exterior. Inside, however, she couldn't help but feel a growing frustration. By the second week, the class was deep into group discussions. Mrs. Thompson had, as promised, assigned the groups for the project on To Kill a Mockingbird. Leah found herself paired with two other students, Rachel and Luke, both of whom had been polite but distant since her arrival. They met after class to plan their approach for the project, which involved analyzing key themes of justice and moral courage in the novel. "So," Leah began, her voice steady as she spread out her notes, "I think we should focus on how the characters show empathy and stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult." Rachel glanced at Leah's notes, nodding slowly. "Yeah, that makes sense," she said, her tone neutral but not unfriendly. Luke, on the other hand, seemed more hesitant. He was watching Leah closely, as if waiting for her to say something out of line. Leah noticed his guarded expression but chose to ignore it. She had learned to pick her battles, and this one wasn't worth the energy. Instead, she continued outlining her ideas, hoping that her thoughtful contributions would help guide the group toward a strong project. The next day in class, Mrs. Thompson's scrutiny intensified. Leah could feel the teacher's eyes on her more frequently, as if waiting for a mistake, some slip that could be used as an excuse to undermine her further. During a routine discussion about the novel's central themes, Leah raised her hand again, this time with renewed confidence. She had thought carefully about what she wanted to say and was determined to contribute meaningfully. "Mrs. Thompson," Leah began when the teacher finally acknowledged her. "I think the novel really explores the power of empathy and how—" "Excuse me, Miss Johnson." Mrs. Thompson interrupted sharply. "Are you chewing gum in my class?" Leah blinked, momentarily thrown by the abrupt accusation. "No, Mrs. Thompson, I'm not," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "Don't lie to me," Mrs. Thompson snapped. "I can see it from here. Go ahead, spit it out." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Leah knew she wasn't chewing gum, but the way Mrs. Thompson was staring at her left little room for argument. Slowly, Leah stood, walked to the trash can, and pantomimed spitting out an imaginary piece of gum. Some of her classmates exchanged uncomfortable glances, while others whispered to each other, enjoying the drama. Leah could feel their eyes on her, but she remained calm, refusing to let the situation rattle her. As she sat back down, Mrs. Thompson gave her a satisfied nod. "Now, as I was saying," the teacher continued, turning back to the board, "the themes in To Kill a Mockingbird are universal. Let's not get sidetracked by irrelevant details." Leah clenched her jaw but kept her composure. She had learned long ago that confronting situations like this directly often only made things worse. Instead, she took a deep breath and focused on the bigger picture. Her father had always told her that integrity was about staying true to oneself, even when others were trying to knock you down. This was one of those moments, and she wasn't about to let Mrs. Thompson win this subtle battle of wills. When the bell rang, Leah gathered her things slowly, her mind already turning to the upcoming group project. She was determined to prove herself, not just to Mrs. Thompson, but to herself. She had come too far to let a little unfairness derail her progress. As she left the classroom, Rachel caught up with her in the hallway. "That was pretty harsh," she said softly, glancing over her shoulder as if checking to see if Mrs. Thompson was watching. But don't let it get to you. You got some good ideas for the project. Leah smiled slightly. Thanks, Rachel. I'm not letting it get to me. Leah spent the weekend working on her group project. She poured herself into it, determined to make sure her contribution was strong, knowing Mrs. Thompson would be scrutinizing every detail. Her father had noticed her spending more time in her room, deep in thought, but Leah had brushed off his questions with reassurances. She didn't want to burden him with her frustrations. After all, he had his own challenges adjusting to his new role as the school's principal. When Monday arrived, Leah entered the classroom with her head held high. She had prepared well and felt confident that her analysis of To Kill a Mockingbird would show her understanding of the novel's deeper themes. The students were buzzing with anticipation as it was presentation day for the group projects. Leah could feel the tension in the room as everyone settled into their seats. Mrs. Thompson began the class with her usual sharp tone, calling the first group to the front. Leah's group would be presenting second. Rachel and Luke joined her at the front of the class when their names were called. Leah stood in the middle, her project board carefully displayed behind her, with neatly organized points about empathy, courage, and moral justice. She had spent hours making sure everything was perfect. Let's begin, Mrs. Thompson said, her eyes narrowing slightly as she settled into her chair. Pen in hand, ready to grade. Leah took a deep breath and started speaking, her voice steady but strong. She had rehearsed this moment in her head countless times, making sure she could articulate her points clearly. As she discussed the novel's exploration of empathy, particularly how characters had to look beyond their own fears to stand up for what was right, she could feel herself gaining momentum. Rachel and Luke followed with their parts of the presentation, but Leah knew she was the one Mrs. Thompson would be focusing on. Halfway through the presentation, Leah paused to ask if there were any questions. Mrs. Thompson's hand shot up immediately. Miss Johnson, she began, her voice dripping with forced politeness. I'm curious as to why you've chosen to focus so heavily on the theme of empathy. Don't you think you're overemphasizing one aspect of the novel while ignoring its broader literary merits? Leah didn't flinch. She had expected this question. I believe empathy is central to the novel's message, she replied calmly. It's what allows characters to understand each other's struggles and make difficult decisions with compassion. Harper Lee herself said that. I'm well aware of what the author said. Mrs. Thompson interrupted, her voice tightening. But I think you're missing the broader point. This novel is about much more than personal feelings. It's about justice, about society's role in shaping the individual. Wouldn't you agree that focusing too much on one theme dilutes the complexity of the work? Leah's fingers tightened around the edge of her presentation board, but she didn't let her frustration show. I think empathy is what drives the characters to pursue justice in the first place, she answered. Without it, they wouldn't have the moral courage to act. A ripple of quiet murmurs passed through the classroom. Some of the students were visibly impressed by Leah's calm response, while others sat in silent discomfort, sensing the tension between teacher and student. Mrs. Thompson leaned back in her chair, a faint smirk playing on her lips. Well, Miss Johnson, I suppose that's one way to interpret it, she said, her tone condescending. But perhaps in future, you might want to broaden your analysis. It's important to look at all angles, not just the ones that resonate with you personally. Leah knew Mrs. Thompson was trying to undermine her, but she didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she simply nodded. Thank you for your feedback, Mrs. Thompson. I'll consider that. As she returned to her seat, Leah could feel the eyes of her classmates on her. Some were supportive, others unsure, but all had witnessed the quiet clash between her and the teacher. It wasn't just about the project. It was a subtle test of Leah's resolve. When the bell rang, signaling the end of the period, Leah gathered her things, ready to leave. As she stepped out into the hallway, Luke caught up with her. You handled it really well, he said, a note of admiration in his voice. Thompson was totally trying to throw you off. Leah smiled, though her heart was still pounding from the intensity of the exchange. Thanks. I just wanted to make sure I got my point across. Luke nodded. You did, and I think more people noticed than you realize. Leah glanced back at the classroom door as it closed behind her. She wasn't sure what the next challenge would be, but she knew she had passed a significant test today. The real battle, however, was far from over. As the days passed, Leah's interaction with Mrs. Thompson continued to simmer just beneath the surface. Unspoken, but palpable. The more Leah participated in class, the more it seemed to irk Mrs. Thompson. Each time Leah raised her hand, the teacher's eyes would narrow slightly, a look of impatience crossing her face before she either ignored Leah or responded with thinly veiled condescension. Leah had grown used to it by now, but it still stung. Despite everything, Leah refused to let Mrs. Thompson's attitude shake her. She continued to speak up in discussions, determined to make the most of her education. After all, she was here to learn, and she wouldn't allow anyone's personal bias or disapproval to get in the way of that. Still, the constant tension was wearing on her. One afternoon, after yet another class where Leah had been subtly shut down by Mrs. Thompson, she found herself feeling particularly frustrated. The class had been discussing themes of moral courage, and Leah had offered her perspective on how understanding others' perspectives was crucial in standing up for what's right. As expected, Mrs. Thompson had immediately interrupted her, shifting the conversation to something unrelated, without even acknowledging Leah's point. It was becoming a pattern, and Leah was beginning to wonder if there was any way to break it. Rachel, one of Leah's group partners, approached her after class. "Hey, I saw how she treated you today," she said, her voice low, as if not wanting anyone else to overhear. "That was pretty harsh. I don't get why she's like that with you." Leah sighed, grateful for the support, but unsure how to respond. "I don't know," she admitted. "It feels like no matter what I say, it's wrong in her eyes. I'm just trying to focus on the work and not let it bother me." Rachel gave her a sympathetic look. "You're doing a good job of that," she said with a small smile. "I'm not sure I could stay that calm if I were in your shoes." Leah smiled back, though the weight of the situation lingered. "Thanks. I guess I just have to keep going." That evening, at home, Leah sat down at the dinner table with her father. Mr. Johnson had noticed that Leah was quieter than usual, her energy subdued. He had a way of reading her moods without her needing to say much. "Everything okay at school?" he asked, his voice gentle but probing. Leah hesitated, unsure of how much to share. She didn't want to burden her father, especially since he was still settling into his role as principal. "It's fine," she said, a little too quickly. But when her father raised an eyebrow, she sighed and relented. "There's just this one teacher, Mrs. Thompson. She doesn't seem to like me much. No matter what I say, she finds a way to dismiss it." Mr. Johnson frowned slightly. "Mrs. Thompson? Your English teacher?" Leah nodded. "Yeah, I'll try to stay calm and do my work, but she keeps cutting me off in class. It's like nothing I say is good enough." Her father was quiet for a moment, considering. "Leah," he said softly, "sometimes people don't understand others, and it makes them react in ways that aren't fair. But you've always been someone who stands firm in what you believe. Don't let this discourage you." Leah looked down at her plate, her thoughts swirling. She knew her father was right, but it was hard to stay positive when she felt so deliberately sidelined. "I won't," she replied quietly, "but it's getting harder." Her father reached across the table, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "Just keep being you. You're stronger than you know." The conversation stayed with Leah as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling. The weight of Mrs. Thompson's treatment felt heavier after talking to her dad. But at the same time, his words gave her strength. She didn't have to change for anyone, least of all for someone who couldn't see her worth. The next morning, Leah woke up with a renewed sense of determination. She would continue to do her best, no matter how much Mrs. Thompson tried to undermine her. There was more at stake than just a grade in a class. This was about her own self-respect and her belief in herself. Leah walked into class the next morning with a fresh sense of purpose. But there was still an air of unease between her and Mrs. Thompson. The teacher barely acknowledged Leah's presence as she took her seat. The other students, by now accustomed to the tension, exchanged glances as Mrs. Thompson began the lesson. Today, they were wrapping up their discussion on To Kill a Mockingbird, and Leah knew that it would likely be another opportunity for Mrs. Thompson to undermine her contributions. Still, she was prepared. The lesson began with an open discussion. Mrs. Thompson encouraged the students to analyze different elements of the novel's conclusion. Several students raised their hands, and Leah listened quietly, waiting for her chance to speak. When the topic turned to the idea of moral courage, something Leah had already prepared thoughts on, she raised her hand. Mrs. Thompson's eyes swept the room, deliberately skipping over Leah's hand. She called on another student instead. Leah lowered her hand, disappointment pooling in her stomach, but she refused to let it show on her face. She scribbled a few more notes, determined not to let the moment get to her. As the discussion continued, Leah couldn't shake the growing frustration. She knew she had something valuable to contribute, something that would enrich the conversation. But it was clear that Mrs. Thompson was going to ignore her again. Just as Leah was about to give up on participating, Mrs. Thompson turned to the class with a sharp look. "All right, let's hear some final thoughts," Mrs. Thompson said. "Leah, since you've been quiet today, why don't you share your thoughts on the themes of justice in the novel?" Leah looked up, startled that Mrs. Thompson had actually addressed her. She wasn't sure if it was a genuine invitation or just a way to put her on the spot. But she wasn't going to miss the opportunity. "Justice in the novel," Leah began, her voice steady, "isn't just about the legal system. It's about the choices people make, choosing empathy and understanding even when it's difficult. That's where real justice comes from people standing up for each other, not just following the law." Mrs. Thompson's smile was tight, almost forced. "Interesting," she said, "but I think you're oversimplifying it. Justice is about maintaining order, and sometimes that means making hard decisions for the greater good, not just individual emotions." Leah could feel the familiar sting of being dismissed. Her thoughts felt more complex than that, but Mrs. Thompson was intent on reducing them to something less meaningful. Still, Leah wasn't about to back down. "I understand that," Leah replied, keeping her voice calm. "But sometimes the greater good comes from seeing the humanity in others. That's what makes the characters in the novel brave. They don't just follow the rules. They choose to do what's right, even when it's hard." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Leah's classmates were listening intently now, sensing that this wasn't just another debate. Leah felt the weight of their eyes on her, but she remained composed. She knew she had spoken her truth. Mrs. Thompson's expression hardened slightly, her frustration evident. "I see," she said curtly. "Well, perhaps in your analysis, you're focusing too much on feelings rather than the broader implications of justice. We need to understand that justice isn't always about doing what feels right. It's about making the right decisions for society." Leah wanted to respond, to push back on the idea that justice was only about order. But something inside her told her to stop. She had said enough, and it was clear that Mrs. Thompson wasn't going to engage her in a meaningful way. Leah nodded, signaling that she was done. "Thank you, Leah," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice cool. "Let's move on." The rest of the class passed by in a blur, but Leah could feel the shift in the room. The students seemed quieter, more thoughtful, as if they were all processing the tension they had witnessed. When the bell rang, Leah gathered her things slowly, her mind still replaying the exchange. As she made her way to the door, Mrs. Thompson called out to. Leah turned, her heart sinking. She had been hoping to slip out without another confrontation. But clearly, Mrs. Thompson had something more to say. "Yes, Mrs. Thompson?" Leah asked, keeping her tone polite, though her body felt tense. The teacher's face softened slightly, but her words still carried a sharp edge. "I just want to remind you that in this class, we focus on analysis, not personal interpretations. I'd hate to see you fall behind because you're too caught up in feelings rather than facts." Leah met her gaze calmly. "I understand," she replied evenly. "But I also think personal understanding is part of how we analyze things. It's how we connect to the stories we read." Mrs. Thompson didn't respond immediately, and for a moment, the two stood there in silence. Then, with a dismissive nod, Mrs. Thompson turned back to her desk. Leah took that as her cue to leave. As she walked down the hallway, Leah could feel the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on her. She had stood her ground, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a slow, painful battle, one that was far from over. Leah walked through the halls of Oakwood High with a strange mixture of resolve and exhaustion. Standing her ground in Mrs. Thompson's class had become a routine, but the emotional toll was undeniable. She had tried to rise above the subtle dismissals, the way her insights were often undermined, but each interaction left her feeling drained. Today was no different. As she headed toward the exit, her mind swirling with thoughts of the day's events, she heard her name called from behind. "Leah, wait up!" She turned to see Rachel hurrying to catch up with her. Leah paused, letting her catch her breath before they walked toward the parking lot together. Rachel had been one of the few classmates to show kindness toward Leah, offering support when Mrs. Thompson's treatment became too blatant to ignore. "That was rough today," Rachel said, glancing at Leah with a mixture of sympathy and frustration. "I can't believe she keeps doing that to you. It's like she's not even listening." Leah shrugged, though she appreciated the concern. "It's fine. I guess I'm just getting used to it." "But you shouldn't have to get used to it," Rachel protested, her voice lowering as they passed a group of students. "I mean, you made such good points today," and she just brushed them off like they didn't matter. "That's not fair." Leah let out a soft sigh. "I know, but what am I supposed to do? If I push back too hard, it'll only make things worse. I don't want to become the problem student." Rachel frowned, clearly unhappy with the situation, but unsure how to help. "It's just people notice. You know, a lot of us see what's happening. It's not like we're blind to it." Leah smiled, appreciating Rachel's honesty. "Thanks. It helps to know that some people see it. I just don't know how to change anything." They walked in silence for a few moments before Rachel spoke again, this time more hesitantly. "Have you thought about talking to your dad about it? I mean, he is the principal." Leah stiffened slightly at the suggestion. She had thought about it many times, but had always dismissed the idea. The last thing she wanted was for people to think she was using her father's position to solve her problems. It felt too easy, too much like taking a shortcut. She wanted to handle things on her own terms. "I don't know," Leah said slowly. "He's got enough on his plate already. Besides, it would just make things awkward. I don't want to cause more trouble." Rachel looked unconvinced, but didn't push the matter further. Instead, she offered Leah a supportive smile. "Well, if you ever need to talk, you know where to find me. We're all behind you, even if it doesn't always feel like it." Leah returned the smile, feeling a warmth she hadn't expected. "Thanks, Rachel. That really means a lot." As they parted ways and Leah walked toward her car, she found herself thinking about her father's words from the night before. He had always taught her to stand firm in her beliefs, to stay true to herself, no matter what others thought. But the situation with Mrs. Thompson was testing her patience in ways she hadn't anticipated. That evening, as Leah sat at the dinner table with her father, she found herself thinking about Rachel's suggestion. She hadn't planned to bring it up, but the words tumbled out before she could stop them. "Dad, can I ask you something?" Mr. Johnson looked up from his meal, his expression attentive. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Leah hesitated for a moment before continuing. "What would you do if you knew a teacher wasn't being fair to a student? Like, if they were treating them differently, not listening to them, that kind of thing?" Her father's expression grew thoughtful. "I'd want to know the details," he said carefully. "Every situation is different, but fairness is important. Teachers have a responsibility to treat their students with respect, to give them the space to express their ideas." Leah nodded, her thoughts swirling. She wasn't sure if she was ready to tell him the full story yet, but his response gave her a sense of comfort. "I was just wondering. It's something I've been thinking about lately." Mr. Johnson gave her a small smile, the kind that told her he understood more than she was letting on. "Well, you know you can talk to me if you ever need advice. I'm always here." Leah smiled back, grateful for his support. "I know. Thanks, Dad." Later that night, as Leah lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she thought about the day's events. The constant push and pull with Mrs. Thompson, the subtle encouragement from her classmates, and her father's quiet but steady presence in her life. She didn't know what the right path forward was, but she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. The thought gave her a sense of peace as she drifted off to sleep, knowing that the battle wasn't over. but she was ready to face whatever came next. The next few days passed quietly, but the weight of Leah's situation with Mrs. Thompson lingered in her mind. Every class felt like a slow battle of wills, where Leah's thoughts were routinely dismissed or criticized. Still, she maintained her composure, determined not to let the tension disrupt her focus. But Rachel's suggestion had taken root in her thoughts. Maybe she should tell her father what was happening. After all, she hadn't done anything wrong. If Mrs. Thompson's behavior was unfair, wasn't it her father's job as principal to know? One evening, after a particularly draining day at school, Leah found herself sitting at the dinner table with her father. The familiar sense of unease bubbling up again. She knew it was time to say something, but she didn't want to sound like she was complaining. She didn't want her father to think she was trying to use his position for an easy way out. Her father, as always, seemed to sense her internal struggle. He glanced at her with a gentle smile, his voice calm but probing. "You've been quiet again this week. Everything okay?" Leah hesitated, picking at the edge of her napkin. This time, she wasn't going to brush him off. She had thought long and hard about it, and Rachel's words continued to echo in her mind. "We're all behind you, even if it doesn't always feel like it." Maybe her father would be too. "Actually, there's something I've been meaning to talk to you about," Leah began, her voice careful. She wasn't sure where to start, but once she opened her mouth, the words seemed to come on their own. "It's about Mrs. Thompson." Mr. Johnson's face grew thoughtful, his brow furrowing slightly as he leaned forward to listen. "Go on," he said, his tone neutral but attentive. Leah took a deep breath, trying to frame the situation clearly. "It's just, she doesn't treat me the same way she treats the other students. Whenever I speak up in class or try to contribute, she finds a way to dismiss me. It's like she doesn't think anything I say matters." Mr. Johnson's expression darkened slightly, though he remained calm. "Has this been going on for a while?" Leah nodded. "Since the beginning. I've tried to just do my work and ignore it. But it's getting harder. Every time I participate, it feels like she's trying to make me feel small, like my thoughts aren't worth as much as the others. And it's not just me. Some of the other students have noticed too." For a moment, her father said nothing, his face unreadable. Then he leaned back in his chair, taking a long, thoughtful breath. "Leah," he began gently, "I had no idea this was happening, but I'm really proud of you for sticking with it and not letting her attitude stop you from speaking up." Leah felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words, but her frustration still lingered. "I didn't want to make things awkward by bringing it up with you," she admitted. "I thought maybe it would seem like I was asking for special treatment." Mr. Johnson shook his head firmly. "That's not what this is about. It's not about special treatment. It's about fairness. Every student deserves to be heard and treated with respect. And if a teacher isn't doing that, it's my responsibility to address it." Leah looked down, her fingers tracing the edge of the table. "I just don't want to make it worse," she murmured. "You won't," her father reassured her. "But I do need to handle this carefully. Let me talk to her. I'll approach it in a way that won't put you in an uncomfortable position." Leah felt a wave of relief wash over her, even though she knew that the conversation with Mrs. Thompson might be difficult. "Thanks, Dad," she said softly. "I didn't know what to do." Mr. Johnson reached across the table, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. "You did the right thing by telling me. This isn't something you have to handle alone." That night, as Leah lay in bed, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. For the first time since the trouble with Mrs. Thompson had started, she didn't feel like the burden was hers alone to carry. Her father would address the situation, and maybe, just maybe, things would start to change. The next morning, when Leah walked into class, she noticed something different. Mrs. Thompson wasn't her usual sharp self. There was a subtle unease in her demeanor, a faint hesitation as she moved through the lesson. Leah couldn't be sure if her father had already spoken to her, but she had a feeling that something had shifted. As the class went on, Leah participated as usual, offering her thoughts during the discussion. For the first time in a long time, Mrs. Thompson didn't cut her off. She didn't dismiss Leah's ideas with her typical condescending tone. Instead, she listened, perhaps not warmly, but attentively. It wasn't a victory yet, Leah thought, but it was a start. And for now, That was enough. The air in Mrs. Thompson's classroom felt different the next day, though Leah couldn't pinpoint exactly why. The usual tension was still there, but something had shifted in the way Mrs. Thompson addressed the class. Leah noticed that the sharp edge in her tone was slightly dulled, as though she was being more deliberate with her words. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was enough for Leah to notice. Leah sat quietly at her desk, waiting to see how the day's lesson would unfold. It had only been a day since her conversation with her father, and she couldn't help but wonder if he had already spoken to Mrs. Thompson. If he had, it wasn't obvious, at least not yet. But the subtle change in Mrs. Thompson's demeanor made Leah hopeful that things might improve. The lesson for the day was about symbolism in literature, and Mrs. Thompson, as usual, launched into her explanation with her usual efficiency. The class followed along, taking notes as she spoke about the use of recurring imagery and metaphors in classic novels. Leah was focused, taking notes carefully, but she was also waiting for that moment when she could raise her hand and see if anything had truly changed. When Mrs. Thompson opened the floor for discussion, Leah took a deep breath and raised her hand. There was a moment of hesitation, but then Mrs. Thompson looked directly at her. "Yes, Leah," she said, her voice calm, but without the familiar hint of condescension. Leah blinked, surprised by the neutrality in her tone. She gathered her thoughts and began to speak, offering her interpretation of how certain symbols in the novel reflected deeper themes of emotional growth. For the first time in what felt like forever, Mrs. Thompson didn't interrupt or redirect the conversation. Instead, she listened, her expression thoughtful. And when Leah finished speaking, she nodded. "That's an interesting perspective, Leah," Mrs. Thompson said, her tone measured. "I think that's worth considering alongside some of the other themes we've discussed." It wasn't exactly high praise, but it wasn't the dismissal Leah had come to expect either. It was a simple acknowledgement, but it meant the world to Leah. She could feel a weight lifting from her shoulders, and she allowed herself to relax. Just a little. The rest of the class continued with the usual rhythm, and though Mrs. Thompson's behavior was far from warm, Leah felt that something had cracked, just slightly. It was a small step, but it was progress, and Leah had learned to appreciate even the smallest victories. After class, as the students were gathering their things, Mrs. Thompson called out, "Leah, can I speak with you for a moment?" Leah's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her expression calm as she approached the front of the classroom. The other students filed out, leaving her alone with Mrs. Thompson. The teacher's expression was unreadable, but her tone wasn't harsh when she spoke. "I just wanted to let you know that I appreciate the effort you've been putting into class. I know it hasn't been easy, but I've noticed your work." Leah was caught off guard by the unexpected acknowledgement. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was something. Mrs. Thompson had never been the type to offer praise, especially to her. For a moment, Leah wasn't sure how to respond. "Thank you," Leah finally said, her voice soft but steady. "I'm just trying to do my best." Mrs. Thompson nodded, her face still guarded, but there was a brief flicker of something in her eyes, something like understanding. "I can see that. Keep it up." Leah left the classroom feeling lighter, though she wasn't entirely sure what to make of the conversation. Mrs. Thompson hadn't apologized, hadn't explained her previous behavior, but Leah could tell that the wall between them was beginning to crumble, even if only slightly. When Leah got home that evening, her father was waiting in the kitchen, sorting through papers from work. He looked up when she walked in, giving her a warm smile. "How was school today?" Leah hesitated, then smiled back. "Better," she said simply. "I think things are changing." Mr. Johnson nodded, as if he already knew. "I'm glad to hear that," he said softly. "Sometimes it just takes a little time." Leah nodded, thinking about Mrs. Thompson's words and the shift in her tone. It wasn't everything she had hoped for, but it was a start, and sometimes that was enough. For now, Leah was content to let things unfold at their own pace. She had fought hard to be heard, and she wasn't going to stop now. But at least, for the first time in a long while, she felt like her voice was finally starting to matter. Leah noticed that in the days following her conversation with Mrs. Thompson, the classroom felt lighter. It wasn't a dramatic shift, but the subtle changes were there. The air, once thick with tension, seemed less stifling. Mrs. Thompson no longer watched Leah with the same guarded expression. Instead, her responses were more measured, and she had stopped interrupting Leah in the middle of her contributions. It was a small but meaningful victory, and Leah's confidence grew with each passing day. However, it wasn't just the interactions between Leah and Mrs. Thompson that had changed. The other students had started to pay attention as well. Some who had previously been quiet during class discussions now seemed more willing to speak up, as though Leah's persistence had sparked something in them. Others, who had once snickered at Mrs. Thompson's dismissals of Leah's ideas, now watched more carefully, their attitudes shifting. One afternoon, as the class worked on group assignments, Leah was deep in conversation with Rachel and Luke, discussing the final aspects of their project. The group dynamic had improved since they started working together, with both Rachel and Luke becoming more engaged in their shared analysis. Leah had always been determined to put her best work forward, but it felt different now, more collaborative, less like she was swimming against the tide. Luke leaned over the table, looking at Leah with an appreciative nod. "I've got to say, Leah, you've been handling all of this really well. Thompson's been rough, but you've kept your cool." Leah smiled slightly, feeling the warmth of his words. "Thanks. It wasn't easy, but I guess I just couldn't let her shut me down. I care too much about this stuff." Rachel chimed in, her voice soft but sincere. "It's inspiring. Honestly, you didn't give up, even when it felt like she wasn't listening." Leah's heart swelled at their words, realizing just how much had changed since the beginning of the school year. She had felt so isolated at first, but now, sitting with her classmates, she could see that her struggle hadn't gone unnoticed. People were watching, and maybe her persistence had started to ripple out beyond just her own experience. As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Leah gathered her things, her mood light. She was heading toward the door when Sarah, a quiet student who usually kept to herself, approached her. "Hey, Leah," Sarah said shyly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to say, I've noticed what you've been doing, standing up for yourself. It's been really helpful for me." Leah blinked, taken aback by the unexpected admission. "Really? I didn't think anyone noticed." Sarah smiled softly, her eyes downcast. "Yeah, I've always been too scared to speak up in class. But seeing you not back down, it's made me think maybe I should try." Too. Leah felt a surge of emotion, a sense of solidarity she hadn't expected. "You should," she said encouragingly. "Your voice matters, just as much as anyone else's. I know it's hard, but you don't have to be afraid to speak up." Sarah nodded, her smile widening just a little. "Thanks, Leah. I'll try." As Sarah walked away, Leah stood in the hallway, absorbing the impact of what had just happened. She had spent so long feeling like she was fighting this battle alone, but now she could see that her actions had resonated with others. It wasn't just about her anymore. Her quiet resistance had inspired her classmates, even though she hadn't realized were watching. That evening, as Leah walked into her house, her father was at the kitchen counter, preparing dinner. He looked up as she entered, his eyes warm with curiosity. "How was your day?" he asked. As he always did, Leah smiled, her mind still buzzing with the small but meaningful interactions she'd had with her classmates. "Good," she said. "Really good." Mr. Johnson raised an eyebrow, sensing something deeper in her words. "Care to share?" Leah took a seat at the counter, resting her chin in her hands. "It's just things are changing, not just with Mrs. Thompson, but with everyone else, too. People are starting to speak up more. It's like, I don't know, maybe all that effort wasn't just for me." Her father smiled gently, pride evident in his eyes. That's the thing about standing up for yourself. It often inspires others to do the same. Sometimes the change starts with just one person, and it spreads. Leah nodded thoughtfully, realizing how true those words were. Her own quiet fight for fairness in Mrs. Thompson's class had become something larger, something that was helping others find their own voices. As she headed to bed that night, Leah felt a new sense of peace. The battle with Mrs. Thompson wasn't fully over, but the progress was undeniable. More importantly, Leah had discovered that her persistence had meaning far beyond herself. She had learned that change, however small, could start with one person standing firm in what they believed, and that person could spark a transformation that touched many lives. As Leah walked into Mrs. Thompson's class the next morning, she felt a growing sense of calm, something that had been missing for months. The atmosphere in the classroom had shifted noticeably. There was no longer the thick tension that had once clung to every interaction. Leah had found her voice, and though Mrs. Thompson had not entirely warmed to her, the small moments of acknowledgement and fairness had made all the difference. The lesson for the day focused on writing techniques and crafting persuasive arguments. It was an important class, one that would help prepare the students for their upcoming essays. Mrs. Thompson stood at the front of the room, explaining how to build a solid argument, using examples from literature to demonstrate effective points. Leah listened intently, jotting down notes as Mrs. Thompson outlined the structure of a strong essay. At one point during the lecture, Mrs. Thompson asked the class to brainstorm topics for their final essay. It was a crucial assignment that would contribute heavily to their final grade. Leah felt a familiar spark of excitement as she thought about the possibilities. This was the kind of challenge she enjoyed. When the time came for students to share their ideas, Leah raised her hand. There was a brief pause, but then Mrs. Thompson called on her, her tone neutral. "Leah, go ahead." Leah stood up, steadying herself before she spoke. "I'd like to explore the theme of moral courage in literature, specifically how characters face challenges when they have to make decisions that go against societal norms. I think it's important to look at how personal ethics and bravery shape the way they act, even when it's difficult." Mrs. Thompson listened quietly, her expression unreadable. Leah wasn't sure how her idea would be received, but she had spoken confidently, laying out her thoughts in a clear, organized way. After a moment, Mrs. Thompson nodded. "That's a solid concept, Leah," she said. "I'll be interested to see how you develop it. Just make sure you back up your points with strong examples from the text." Leah blinked, surprised by the directness of Mrs. Thompson's response. It wasn't enthusiastic praise, but it was an acknowledgement of her idea, something she hadn't received without resistance before. Leah nodded back, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction as she sat down. The class continued, and other students shared their ideas. Leah could feel the energy in the room shifting as more of her classmates seemed willing to contribute. Some ideas were bold and creative, others more straightforward, but there was a sense of openness in the discussion that hadn't existed at the start of the school year. After class, as Leah gathered her things, Mrs. Thompson approached her desk. Leah felt a flicker of anxiety, though things had improved. There was always that part of her that still feared criticism. But when she looked up, Mrs. Thompson's face was calm, almost reflective. "Leah," she began, her voice softer than usual, "I can see you put a lot of thought into your work lately. I've been hard on you, I know, but I want you to know that it wasn't personal." Leah's eyes widened slightly in surprise. This was the closest Mrs. Thompson had ever come to acknowledging her behavior. There was no direct apology, but it was a step in the right direction. "I appreciate that," Leah said carefully, her voice measured. "I just wanted to make sure my ideas were heard." Mrs. Thompson nodded. "They are. Keep pushing yourself. You've got potential." As Mrs. Thompson turned and walked away, Leah felt a strange mix of emotions. There was no grand reconciliation, no sudden friendship, but that wasn't what Leah had expected. What she had received was more valuable, a grudging respect, an acknowledgement of her worth, and a shift in how she was perceived in the classroom. Later that day, Leah found herself thinking about the journey she'd been on. She had started the school year feeling like an outsider, unsure if she would ever truly belong in Mrs. Thompson's class. But through perseverance, support for her classmates, and the strength she had found within herself, things had changed. At home that evening, Leah sat with her father, who was reading through some work papers at the kitchen table. He looked up and smiled when he saw her, his eyes curious. "How's it going?" he asked, the usual warmth in his tone. Leah sat down across from him, her heart feeling lighter than it had in weeks. "It's going well," she said. "Better, actually." Mrs. Thompson, She's not the same with me anymore. She's listening." Mr. Johnson smiled, a look of pride spreading across his face. "I'm glad to hear that," he said. "I knew you could handle it." Leah nodded. "It wasn't easy, but I think I've learned a lot about standing up for myself and about patience." As the evening turned to night, Leah felt a sense of peace settle over her. There were still challenges ahead, both in school and beyond. But for now, she had found her place. She had discovered the power of her own voice. And that, more than anything, gave her the strength to keep moving forward. Thank you all for joining us on Leah's journey of perseverance and self-discovery. Her story reminds us of the power of resilience, the importance of standing up for what's right, and how small acts of courage can inspire change in those around us. We hope you found inspiration in Leah's experience, and that it encourages you to find your own voice in the face of challenges. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.